All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. See, we've got people filtering in. See some familiar names in there. Welcome everyone. So glad that you're here. We're going to give it a few minutes before we get started. That way we just give a little bit of time for people to join us. But thank you for being here. If you'd like to, this is always a little tradition for us on these webinars, to open up your chat. You should be able to see it on the little Zoom bar at the bottom of the window, the Zoom window. Going to open up the chat box. Just tell us your name and where you're coming from, school, organization, and area of the country. We often get a lot of folks from New Jersey, but we've also been getting folks from other areas of the country. So we just love to hear where you're coming from today. And thanks for being here. Thanks, Paul. Wart, New Jersey says hello. Awesome. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome. Manville. Yeah, shout out to Manville. Welcome, Danielle. Brooklyn. That's great. Welcome. Brooklyn, Lawrence Intermediate. Welcome. Union City High School. Welcome. New York, Basking Ridge, Plainsboro. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're so glad that you're here. If you would, just open up the chat and let us know where you're coming from today. I'd always love to see where people are coming from. We'll get started in a few minutes. Florin Park, Christina Sykes Academy. Awesome. Welcome. Bridgewater. This is great. Got folks coming from all over. Morristown, Monroe, North Brunswick. Shout out to PA. Welcome. Awesome. Union City, upstate New York. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Just give it another minute here before we get started. All right, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, if you want to keep typing into the chat where you're coming from, it's always great to see that. I just want to express gratitude at the beginning of the session for taking the time of your day to join us for this important conversation. My name is Jesse Bassett, and I'm the Director of Education at Good Grief. I am joined today by Joe Primo, who is our CEO at Good Grief, who I will formally introduce here in a minute. And we are going to have a conversation on the topic, spirituality of youth facing adversity, that I think is oftentimes under-discussed and even stigmatized a lot in our communities, talking about religion, spirituality, meaning making in the wake of experiences of loss and adversity, an incredibly important part of that experience, but I think oftentimes not talked about. So we're going to dive into that discussion today in a minute. A few logistics before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will upload the recording to our YouTube channel so that you can reference back to it or share it with other people within your network if you really liked it. And as this is Joe's content, we do ask that you not reproduce or redistribute it as a training without reaching out to us directly to ask about it first. We will be doing some questions at the end, and Joe will be pausing periodically to check in and answer questions. So feel free to put questions into the Q&A box. It's harder for us to keep track of them in the chat, as I know all of us have experienced this. The chat can sometimes move pretty quickly. The Q&A is just much more organized, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the time that we have. If you did put out a question that we weren't able to get to, feel free to reach out to us. You'll be getting follow-up emails. Be happy to support you and answer any questions that you have. We will also, you will receive a certificate of attendance for coming to this training. When you fill out the survey at the end, it will link it out to that certificate, but also it will be in an email that will get distributed to you tomorrow following, excuse me, following the session. If you are calling in today and you're not in via your computer or signed in on the app through your phone, it's harder for us to track you. I've gotten a few responses about this where we can't always tell that you're here. So if you are calling in, I see a couple people that have called in today, just send us an email and let me know, hey, I was in the session, and I'll make sure that we get you the certificate and the materials from today's webinar. All right, so for those who are new to Good Grief, we are a New Jersey-based nonprofit whose mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. Our work since 2004 has centered on supporting grieving children and families after the death of a family member, but also our work has kind of grown over recent years through education and advocacy work in places like schools. Joe, I'm wondering if you could go forward to that next slide for me. Yeah, so this program today and a lot of the webinars we've been doing is through our Good Grief Schools initiative. In recent years, the organization's work has expanded into school spaces to provide things like professional development workshops, parent education training, a social and emotional learning curriculum called Roots to Resilience, and Good Grief Groups, a peer support group for students who have experienced grief and loss. If you want to learn more about Good Grief Schools or any of our other work, I encourage you to check out our website. And I'm going to go ahead and put that into the chat. It's good-grief.org, and I'm going to put in the backslash for you to land on the schools page on our website there. So poke around. There's lots of great resources. I'll link out some additional ones at the end, but I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in learning more about who we are and what we do. All right, Joe, go ahead and move forward to the next one for me if you would. All right, so Joe Primo is the CEO of Good Grief and a leading voice on grief, mourning, and building resilience in children, families, and communities in the face of loss and adversity. Joe is an international speaker and commentator, and Joe serves on the board of Option B at the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation. He's the author of What Do We Tell the Children? Talking to Kids About Death and Dying. Joe has served as a national spokesperson for the Funeral Service Foundation's Youth in Funerals Initiative and is a past president of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. Joe received his Master of Divinity degree from Yale University, where he concentrated on end-of-life care. He later served as a hospice chaplain at both the Connecticut Hospice and the Hospice of Southeastern Connecticut. On a personal note, Joe has been a significant mentor and a friend to me in this work, and I'm really, really grateful that Joe has taken the time today to be able to share his experience and his perspective on this topic. So Joe, thank you so much for being here. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. And thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited that you have joined us for this conversation on spirituality and adversity. Just like Jesse said, this is a conversation that does not get the attention or the thoughtfulness that it deserves. You know, back in 2007, the founding board of directors for Good Grief hired me to build and design Good Grief's programs, which, as Jesse shared in talking about Good Grief Schools, would ultimately evolve and redefine our mission over the years. But you know, my perspective since 2007 is actually rooted in a spiritual framework. Now, prior to Good Grief, as Jesse said, I was a chaplain at the Connecticut Hospice, which is the birthplace of the hospice movement in the US. And despite the fact that it's the foremother of end-of-life care, there was no training and really a limited understanding on childhood bereavement. And of course, in my role as chaplain, it was my job to be the one to help children say goodbye to their parent and for parents to say goodbye to their young children. And yet, despite my title at that place, I found myself completely ill-prepared to meet the needs. And because I think that was because I didn't understand how to address the spirituality of youth who were facing one of the greatest adversities of their life. And of course, in this instance, that is the loss of their primary care provider. So today we're gonna go to a different level, a different space, and we're gonna prepare ourselves and having a conversation that is really grounded in two primary questions, which is how did this happen and why did this happen? As human beings, we are spiritual beings. We're spiritual beings because we seek meaning and purpose. We try to understand how the world works and why, and even whether our lives matter. And so the questions, the thoughts, and the conclusions that we have about our purpose is not limited just to adults. It turns out that children are seekers and explorers too, who look to us adults for guidance and for wisdom. And I'm going to return to that word wisdom a bit later, because as we start to make some paradigm shifts in our thinking, and as we stretch ourselves to think beyond our worldview, we'll see that wisdom has a way of shaking off cliches and trite sound bites that leave us feeling empty. And so in order to do this, we got some goals for today. The first being that we want to understand the historic context of religion and spirituality in the US, and how it's evolving and influencing modern day youth, right? This conversation isn't happening in a vacuum. We got to really contextualize things. We want to reframe some biases and some assumptions about what spirituality is and what it is not. And I want us to develop a framework for supporting youth's spiritual explorations in the environments where they live, learn, and play. So again, where they live, learn, and play. That is also a contextual component to this. So I think the best way to get started for a conversation like this is to go back to your own childhood. Got some questions for you, and then I want to share a story from my childhood. And so let's just take a second here and pause and think about the questions that are on the screen. Really reflect on your own youth. And so, were you raised in a religious or a secular household? Was your household multi-religious? Did you have any thoughts or feelings about rituals or sacred texts or holidays? If you didn't have these things, did you feel left out or different from members of your peer group who did? If you had them, did any of your religious traditions become more of a cultural practice than a religious perspective? And then lastly, do you still hold the same worldview today as you did when you were, say, 12? And so in the chat box, I just want you to drop your response to this last question. Is your spiritual life the same today as it was when you were a child? We're looking at the chats. We are seeing a plethora of no's. Ooh, we had an absolutely not. We have some yeses, not at the moment. We have, it's evolving, it's a journey. The view is different, but the practice is the same in a deeper way. I think that's potentially a good place to pause here. Because life experiences, whether they are through exposure to other people's perspectives, developmental growth from childhood to adulthood, things like the evolution of our life cycle, right? So you think about how your life changes with marriage, having children, facing new adversities, right? All of these things influence our worldview. And so why does that matter? Well, adversity can cause us to hold really tightly onto our worldview and double down on our so-called truths, right? Or it can cause us to reject those things that we once held as true. And I want to lift that up because this change in perspective can also be really disorienting because that change is a form of loss in and of itself. That really adversity impacts and calls into question our identity. And I want to give you a personal example on how that played out for me, right? And even led to me becoming a hospice chaplain to the work that I do now. So I was raised in a very traditional Irish Sicilian household, which is essentially, to point out the obvious, my people are super Catholic. I was super Catholic, but my worldview changed radically in 1996. I was 14. I was visiting my grandparents on summer vacation, and some aunts and uncles came over for lunch. And while we were having lunch, an aunt had a massive heart attack while we were eating our tuna melts. And as my grandmother and uncle tried to revive her, I did the only thing that I knew how to do. I grabbed my grandmother's rosary beads and I prayed my heart out, because the way that I was raised meant that those rosaries were the ultimate tool for helping my aunt. But the thing is, she died. And here I was, having prayed like a champ, thinking that I could change the outcome, but she died nonetheless. And suddenly my whole worldview was tossed on its head. And I didn't just grieve what I saw. I didn't just grieve that loss. My spirituality was thrown into chaos, because I realized that life doesn't work the way that I thought it worked. That experience and that adversity became ultimately a really defining moment for me. And of course, that had everything to do with the death, but it also had to do with the fact that my eyes were opened in a new way that gave me a perspective that was ultimately different from my peers. It was more grounded, I would say, in the realities of life, and it challenged me to ask hard questions, the hard questions of how and why bad and painful things happen. So, adversity, like a death, but really adversity in the form of things like parental divorce, poverty, abuse, neglect, bullying, incarceration, right? All these different manifestations of adversity, in all their forms, they affect a child's whole being. So it's important for us to understand that adversity impacts a child's emotional self, their physical self, their intellectual self, their social network, and their spirituality. And today I'm not going to get into things like the emotional, the physical, and the intellectual parts, but it's really, really important that we understand that this is an interconnected web here, that these five variables impact each other. Um, Fortunately, I think our society is increasing its awareness about social and emotional needs of children, but really, even today, the spiritual aspects are often omitted from these conversations. And while I don't fully know why that's the case, I think it is in part because some think spirituality is a little woo-woo or a little black and white in its thinking, or maybe they're afraid of some sort of religious fanaticism, which is all warranted. But I want to argue that if we're going to build a child's resilience, we need to nurture their spiritual perspective, right? And that is their sense of meaning, their sense of place in the world, and ultimately our shared humanity. Because in so many ways, spirituality is as much about being frail and mortal and incredibly vulnerable humans, right? This is about the human situation that we're talking about here. Um, so if that's the case, why aren't we openly talking about children's spirituality? Why do we so often omit this important aspect of resilience? Well, the research says that mindfulness is effective at mitigating things like anxiety and depression, stress, things like interpersonal conflict, confusion, and even despair. And I would say, based on my professional experience of working at Kids with Good Grief, I fully agree with that research. We see that firsthand, day in and day out. So mindfulness is this critically important tool for building resilience. But do you know what mindfulness is? It is a 7,000-year-old spiritual practice in Buddhism. right? And Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus are just some of the religions that also practice meditation or mindfulness. So here we are nowadays with mindfulness becoming a part of sort of the vernacular, right? And us talking openly about it being a critical component of resilience and risk mitigation for adversities. So we're, in so many ways, we're actively mainstreaming the spiritual needs of youth on the field, in classrooms, around the kitchen table, and again, where children live, learn, and play. But that's not how we're talking about it. I think that needs to settle in there for a second. It exists in all these places, but that's not how we're talking about it. So, taking a guess here, I'd like to argue that America's relationship to religion is ultimately impacting our responsiveness to children's spirituality. That from a historical standpoint, the US has really been a melting pot of religiosity. It's been a refuge for religious radicals and exiles at the time of early colonization, and even today. Now, we've been a place where there has been open hostility between traditions within one religion. So, say Catholics versus Presbyterians, or vice versa, right? All of that is on full display. And it seems to me that a wide variety of hypocrisy, such as the sex and financial scandals to other forms of abuse within religion, has really disillusioned a lot of the public. And the consequence of that is that it's changed how so many parents how so many parents engage spirituality with their children. And the outcome of this is rather significant, as a historic shift, because what that has done is it's also dissolved the communities that families generations ago once really depended on for facing adversities, right? The church religious community was huge as a support system. And as a result, it's also changed how we talk about the spirituality of children. And so here we are in 2021, and more than half of Americans now describe themselves as nuns or non-religious. So nuns here, not to be confused with Julia Andrews and The Sound of Music or other women in black habits, have also gone mainstream. Nuns are the norm. And according to a Pew study, 6 in 10 Americans identify as nuns. And so what does that mean? It means no longer are we able to make assumptions about what people believe and think. And I think that's good. But we've also neglected the thing that makes us human: a shared language for meaning and purpose. So the absence of this shared language, or our attention to the spirituality of children, has not been neglected in other spaces, which I think is really important for us to have awareness about. That this is manifesting elsewhere, right? We could argue that children and teens go to the church of Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and elsewhere for their fulfillment. And really there in those places, in this like sanctuary of self-promotion and uninhibited exposure, children are finding what is otherwise the pillars of religion. They're finding community, which is to say connection. They're finding self-help or meaning making, even if some of that is cliched or without real chops, and I'll come back to that later. They're finding understanding and affirmation by following people or influencers who have a shared perspective. And they're finding gratification. They're finding that through likes and shares. So this cathedral that they find themselves in is enormous, and it's seemingly endless. I think it's tempting as adults to place some judgment on that, because that's not most of our experience. But I don't think that judging that is that format, whether it's good or not, is our job, or that it's necessarily a good thing to do, because to do so would assume that we know the needs of children better than they know the needs themselves. So the adversity piece of where they're finding support raises some important questions for us, right? So when a child faces adversity, they have to ask themselves some enormous questions about how and why this adversity is happening to them. When we don't create an environment for these questions, when we neglect the questions as part of their grief, then I think as adults, we are feeling failing kids. So let's take a look at the virtual spaces kids are using and consider whether these spaces where children are making their meaning are serving a helpful purpose. So let's deconstruct this a little bit. So let's say if a tween experiences the death of a parent, how will their spiritual needs be met or potentially not met on social media? And let's start that with community. So social media has the ability to connect grieving kids with other grieving kids really like never before. So 10 years ago, even we saw this at Good Grief, a kid may have been the only one in their class whose mom died. But today, while that might still be true in the classroom, the grieving kid can find other grieving kids like them. All right. He can find it via hashtag, via groups, organizations that share resources like we do at Good Grief, etc. And that kid can also follow a celebrity with a shared experience and through that gain a role model like never before. We've never seen that historically. So in this way, social media in a really powerful way can break down isolation during adversity. But moving on to meaning making and wisdom, it turns out that everyone not only now has an opinion, they now have a platform to broadcast it widely. So, in a world in which self help books inundate bookshelves at about 19 million sales a year, influencers are inundating social media with essentially the same sort of self help meme and cliches. And I think generally how that gets promoted is as a positive psychology. But these sound bites can really come up empty for someone struggling with a significant adversity, especially a kid. And that's why I have a screenshot here of Brene Brown in her Instagram feed. She's a recent phenomenon on bravery and vulnerability, right? She's got 3.4 million followers on Instagram, and I am one of them. And recently, so I trolled her feed for this presentation because I thought she might give me something good. And she says that vulnerability is defined as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She said in one of her memes that daring greatly means the courage to be vulnerable, to talk about how you're feeling. Okay. I mean, I think I know what that means. And truthfully, we have a similar message at Good Grief, but we say those sorts of things in the context of what happens within our walls at Good Grief. Why? Well, let's take a second. I want you to envision yourself as a 12-year-old. Your mom died. You're hurting. Everyone is telling you to be brave. You stumble upon Brene, maybe you seek her out because your mom loved her, and you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to be brave by being vulnerable. I'm going to share all this emotional pain in this seemingly endless cathedral of sharing that is Instagram or TikTok. But then it blows up in your face. You're bullied because you have a dead mom. Of course, you couldn't have imagined such an outcome. But the thing is, grieving kids are bullied all the time. And here you were swallowing an influencer soundbite without knowing how to contextualize. So, of course, like that's a big ouchie. That's really going to hurt. It hurts because you weren't actually in a relationship with the person on the other side of the screen. And while kids can read and watch these sound bites, they really have to go deeper. So in other words, the difference between the influencer and Instagram, right? And keep in mind, these influencers are essentially preachers in their own right. The difference between the influencers and wisdom is pretty simple. Wise guidance helps a child understand that yes, vulnerability is good, but not every place is safe. Not everyone is a friend. Some people will use your pain to hurt you further. And you may never know why they're doing that, but it's important to know how to differentiate between safe spaces with friends and unsafe spaces. And that wisdom is ultimately gained through a dialogue, not a one-way screen. And so I just really can't emphasize here enough the importance of a two-way dialogue in order to share and create wisdom. Moving on to understanding and affirmation. Well, what about when no one relates? What about when you can't find someone on the internet to affirm your pain or share in your suffering, or even understand your story? We know what that looks like in the classroom for students. It causes isolation and it causes more grief when nobody in the peer group can understand them, right? So, what about when a kid makes a connection and they feel like they're not alone on social media? That's wonderful, right? Yes. But when they can't, then that sense of isolation increases. And this is where we have the proverbial double edged sword. Because for a kid where social media is the world, if they feel that they are alone there, then they may feel alone everywhere because social media is where their lives play out. And then lastly, to continue just dissecting these pillars here, gratification. A 2016 study in psychological science said that likes on social media had an effect on the brain similar to winning the lottery or eating the chocolate. And much like you, like me, you must be thinking, chocolate and cold hard cash. That is divine, right? It does not get better than that. And so, yeah, it feels really good to connect and have your post liked on social media. We know that. And so I think we can make some conclusions here, right, based on this sort of evaluation. And the conclusion goes like this, right, that the online communities where children are facing their adversities and making their meaning are very similar to the in-person places where children face their adversities, right? In person is very similar. That there is connection and isolation, that there is lived experience and wisdom alongside messages that, are cliched or ring a little hollow. There are feel good moments and there's also disappointment. Uh, So ultimately, how do we talk with children about what happens in community? And I mean that both virtually and in person, that we have to consider both. How is it that we process the joys, the sorrows, and the milestones of life, and then find purpose in these interactions and experiences? Well, in order to do that, we got to think big picture here, and we got to take a bit of a deep dive into the spiritual needs of children that exist outside of organized connection. So, whether that is in a religious, spiritual context or on social media. I started off today by asking you about your childhood. Well, why was that so important? It was important because spirituality is influenced by your family. Our family systems carry culture, they carry family history, they've got norms, they have expectations, values, and yes, even some baggage, especially when we're different from our family system. So, family systems can be both harmful and they can be supportive. And I think so often children are expected to prescribe to their family's ideologies. But we know that one of a critical and important part of the developmental stages of teenagers, for example, is to reject the norms of their caretakers, right? And This sort of rejection, this pivot, this course change for a teenager, it's not about the parents or the guardians, but it's absolutely about the teenager who's looking to forge their own identity. They're looking to find their own place in the world. And when we force children to think and believe like we do, we can easily alienate them from the family and from the community. And we can also increase their sense of isolation or create a disconnect between them and their supposed support systems, which is again the family and the community that that family is a part of. And so I want us to ask ourselves, and I mean really, really, really ask ourselves here, what is the worst thing that could happen if we embraced a child's exploration of their spirituality rather than asking them to fit into our prescribed box? What if we gave them some agency here? And the reason why I want you to think about this and why this is such an important question for adults to answer is because you need to know your reaction to the questions that I'm suggesting, because really what I'm saying is adults need to get out of the way. And that's a really big paradigm shift for how adults tend to think about spirituality with their kids. I am suggesting that adults go from being a gatekeeper to the capital T truth to being a companion and a facilitator of a child's exploration and growth. And to use a religious word here, faith. You know, faith would assume that if what you know is true, then the child will return to this truth on their own by doing their own spiritual work through their own exploration, their own questions, and their own reflections. I think based on the work we do with Good Grief, here's what I know. I know that if we affirm a young person's rich inner spiritual lives, then we are affirming that they have both the creativity, the curiosity, and even a groundedness and respect and kindness to do now these three important things. First, to forge their own identity. Second, to create their own worldview. And then lastly, to develop their own meaning and sense of purpose in the world. And so I want to take each of these three things and unpack them a little bit further. First, starting with identity, that forging your own identity asks you who you want to be in the world. That ultimately grief forces this question over and over, especially during acute grief, right? And we know that grief is tied to adversity. So adversity is causing grief, and it forces us to say, who do you want to be in the world? And I think this is where we can also teach empathy and kindness and expose children to other perspectives and lived experiences. That forging identity in so many ways is a values proposition that helps a child decide how they want to do things like respond to a bully or help a friend who is hurting because of an adversity, maybe supporting an aging neighbor up the road, right? Aging neighbors love that, especially as lawn care season approaches. Next, worldview, that a child who creates their own worldview actually may be more malleable when life doesn't go as planned. Because when a kid puts up the scaffolding to get to the rooftop, they can adjust when they realize they are far from getting to where they want to be. And at the end of the day, we all have to wrap our heads around why a gunman would slaughter innocent children in Sandy Hook, or shoppers in Colorado, or masseuses in Atlanta, right? We all have to process the terrible things we hear about, we see on TV, and even the hurt that we feel in our daily lives. And when we do those things, we ask ourselves, why do bad things happen to good people? And really, what is the point of any of this? And from those questions, we really can begin to develop meaning and purpose. And perhaps the answer for a kid will be to go into a helping profession, right? That ultimately was my story from 1996. Perhaps they'll be inspired to change policies around issues that matter to them. Maybe they'll become laser focused on helping their local community in small but meaningful ways. Maybe they'll just conclude that bad luck causes lots of pains, right? Their conclusions may be deep, they may be wise, maybe they're profound. Um, their conclusions may be shallow and naive, but whatever they are, at least they will have shaped them. And I think, as we all know, life is full of so much adversity that no conclusion on suffering is really ever the end, because throughout our lives, we are going to have to return to these questions of how and why bad things happen, and the answers evolve. And again, whatever the answer is to these questions, the answer is going to be the child's. And because they had a chance to explore and ask the questions, they're going to be more resilient and they can adjust accordingly. Now, I totally appreciate the fact that that may sound well and good, and you can say, yes, I want to promote this important exploration of meaning making and identity. But the reality is, it doesn't just happen on its own, that we need to create environments that are caring and supportive for the exploration of these really tough questions, right? And provide the opportunities to be both vulnerable and honest. And as I've shared earlier, when talking about wisdom, wisdom tells us that not every space is safe to do that. And so, what we can do is provide a chance for spiritual formation and character development by being this reliable companion to their process. And so, how do you create that safe space? Well, first, we need to honor the diversity of perspective and appreciate the fact that everybody can experience the same situation and have a different interpretation of it, right? A different perspective on the same shared experience. We need to show up and be open and attentive. While it's easy to be judgmental and to fall into that trap, judgments get in our way. And what they get in the way of oftentimes is our ability to be inquisitive and do the work to understand that different perspective. And we can be inquisitive and better understand by asking open-ended questions that help a young person further explore their ideas. And when they do that, they're better able to articulate their worldview. We can create this safe space also by being vulnerable ourselves, by remaining humble, which is to say, to appreciate the fact that actually we don't have all the answers either. And then, of course, to be empathic. So I think with those sort of broad guidelines in place, I want to offer a framework for actually engaging spirituality. And of course, it always has to start with the acknowledgement of the adversity. And I think so often we live in this culture that chooses to silence or quickly stop talking about an adversity, right? It's almost as if we think, well, that was last week. Let's just see what this week brings, right? Like, we're just going to silver lining this and hope that it's going to be better next week, even though this one was a real crapshoot. But you see, the aftershock of adversity, it's not limited to a timeline. And so, because it's not limited to a timeline, I want to share the Good Grief model with you because I think it starts to introduce some language and way of thinking about this, right? So I said, as a result of how our country has changed with our relationship to religion and spirituality, we've lost some language. Well, I'm not saying that this fully replaces language, but I think it begins to put us on a path to use some words that help us think about this in a new way. So to embrace adversity, when we help children embrace their adversity, they're able to normalize it and, again, to do their grief work. When we sweep experiences under the rug, inevitably these experiences come back to us and they find us unsuspecting and unprepared. When we engage the adversity in the grief, we help a child, um, rather having helped the child embrace their adversity, they're now able to engage it. That means that they can do the work and explore it, right? That they can actually start asking the tough questions. They can wrestle with how and why. And now they're beginning to do some of their meaning making because they're engaging the thing that happened. They're owning their story. And that leads to an integration. And it's from that meaning making that a child can integrate this adversity into who they are, right? That they are a kid whose mom died, but that is not all that they are. They are a kid who lived through a pandemic and are now working to get back on track with their academic goals. They are a kid who built their resilience and they lived to see another day. Right, that when we think about the good grief model and these three components, or they lead to the grief work, and because of that, that is just one of, I think, the key reasons why spirituality can't be excluded from how we support and meet a child's needs, because really in every adversity we draw conclusions, and on those conclusions, that is what is beginning to make the meaning. And that meaning making builds resilience. Um, and to think about that, to further that resilience building, there are some things that we can do, right? Some of this we've already touched upon, but I want to just go a little bit deeper. First, vulnerability. Right? We need to be vulnerability is be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not about giving your advice, but sharing your lived experience and the conclusions that you've made. By speaking from a place of I, that helps a child understand your perspective, and it also helps them make comparisons to your story. And I think, in sort of a similar way, this is how we impart wisdom. I would say that my only caveat here is, just because you think that you were wise as they come, uh, don't expect a child or teen to do as you do or did or learn from your lived experience. Because remember, they may have to go down the same exact rabbit hole only to emerge saying, oh, yeah, that's what mom meant. My bad, won't do that again. That's how they learn. That is okay. And so I would say another way of framing this is role modeling. So often we hear parents at Good Grief say that they're worried that they don't, that their kid never cries in front of them. So, and what we always ask in response is, well, do you cry in front of your child? And the answer is usually no. So create safe space. I know we've already covered this earlier, but let's just, again, as we continue to contextualize, remember that safety is as much about us adults staying curious and empathic as it is about allowing for kids to share and explore. And then affirmation, right? This is a spot that can get a little bit tricky for adults. I think as adults, we believe that we know more. We've lived longer, had more experiences, and we just think, oh yeah, that makes us wiser because we've already walked this road before. Um, but at Good Grief, we very often see tweens and teens take a very different perspective than their parents, especially after a parent dies. And this can be super painful for the surviving parent. But again, like I said earlier, let's just step into their world for just a moment. So a 14-year-old kid is told that God is in control, right? They're told to be good or you'll be punished, maybe in this life or the afterlife. They're told to repent for not honoring your mother and father and for making mommy mad with all the trouble you've been up to. That is one that I heard a bit back in the day. And from that, this religious, spiritual perception is born from all those messages that the kids are absorbing. And now that message has to adapt to dad falling off of a ladder and dying the night before summer vacation. You said God was in control. but God let my dad die. Why in the world would I want to have anything to do with that God? Right? Let's contextualize a very, very rational response. That 14-year-old is trying to make meaning out of what has just happened to his dad. He's asking, how did this happen? How, could this have been prevented? Could anybody have prevented it? Why did this happen to my dad of all people? And so to affirm a kid's experience might look something like like this, right? Here's just a script I'm making up. So mom says, why do you think this is God's fault? The kid would respond, well, you said God is in control and looks after us. How could God let this happen? And the mom says, well, it sounds like you have a lot of doubts about God. To which the kid, remember, this is a 14-year-old, would naturally insert a bunch of expletives right about here. And the mom might say, well, I understand you were really mad. And the kid might respond with silence or a shoulder shrug, right? Because now that kid's being affirmed. And maybe mom might say, well, what if God isn't in control and didn't make this happen? What if it just happened? I have a lot of questions too. I think the challenge here for adults is that we do our own meaning making too, that we have the same questions to ask and we are also seeking answers. And so adults can come to different conclusions to their kids or from their kids or vice versa. And that is okay. And I don't mean to get into different theological perspectives here, but I do want to just make a few comments to help us expand our thinking. So, this dialogue that I just made up, it's pretty reflective of a simplistic worldview, which may be hard for, say, a critical thinking kid to absorb, right? That we tend in childhood to introduce spirituality to children in really the most simplistic terms. It can look something like, there is a God or gods, the divine is in control, be good or there are consequences. And this sort of theology, it really isn't the most helpful thing to a kid who is facing adversity. And I think we're far along enough in this conversation here to probably understand why. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, adversity throws our lives upside down. That kids begin to see through their adverse experiences that actually there are a heck of a lot of unknowns. And so, in other words, there are so many things that we don't have answers to. And yet, a kid is very frequently going to be able to find, probably with little to no effort, an adult who is going to manufacture an answer or meaning to fix or problem solve the inexplicable or the unjust. And so for us as adults, we have to be a bit more nuanced when stepping into, let's call it the intersectionality of spirituality and adversity. And for that, my greatest encouragement to adults is that we get comfortable, get really, really comfortable with the lack of answers, and then to be open to the diversity of lived experiences, right? And the many truths that comprise the capital T truth. And really, let's be honest here, the general mystery and absurdity that we even exist to face adversity at all. And so I want to land this conversation essentially where we started, that we're human beings, and that makes us spiritual beings who seek meaning and purpose, both in our lives and in the context of our adversities. That our vulnerabilities, our struggles, our losses, and even our mortality, our even knowledge of that mortality or the mortality of those around us, that those things form our spiritual essence. And like our emotional response to adversity, our spiritual response is equally as important. And kids need facts to help them understand as much as they require connection to others, to help them find their purpose. And ultimately, when we affirm a child's rich inner life, which includes their spiritual lives, we're helping them build resilience. So just really quickly here to recap what we learned. Adversity affects every aspect of a child's life and worldview. Adversity has 5 components. This is a really helpful paradigm shift here, because then we can appreciate that 1/5 of that is spiritual. That kids need a safe space to explore and to question, that forging one's own meaning is developmentally and individually important, that kids are finding their meaning on social media, which requires adult guidance. Wisdom is the ability to differentiate between cliche and another person's lived experience, ultimately while contextualizing that message for meaning and application. Role modeling with your vulnerability empowers a child to explore and question. And then of course, questioning and exploring leads to capital T truth and the many truths and purpose and forming a worldview. And we are all seeking truth. So let's be patient with a child's exploration of that. And as always, and in all things, be aware of your own history, your own biases, and your own perceived truths. And so here we are with just a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm wondering if people would be willing, if you would use the Q&A box for any questions. You should see a little Q&A button there. Joe, I wanted to get us started with one question that I have. So you talk about wisdom in that presentation and this idea of role modeling. And a question that I hear a lot from educators and other people is around this idea of kind of the like fear of saying too much, like overstepping their role and sharing about their own kind of experiences. You know, there's the fears around like, will parents get mad at me if I share too much about my own experiences, those kinds of things. So I'm wondering if you had any kind of advice for people here who, whether they're an educator or they play some other professional role, how to maybe navigate through that complex terrain in these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, I think there are some guiding principles, right? First, if you don't make assumptions and you have a mindset in which you're appreciating the universality, speaking about things in universal truths, right? So it's not about here's how to make meaning, but what is that experience? What is this experience like for you? What we say so many times at Good Grief is to be the dunce, right? So when we talk with our volunteers and our facilitators, to walk into a situation, even if you may have some answers, acting like you don't have any. And that's okay, because when you're the dunce, you're taking the time to explore that child's experience. And again, if you're thinking in universal terms and you're being vulnerable and you're sharing personally, you're driving a conversation towards understanding somebody else's story. And I think that is safe territory, especially if you use some of the words that we discussed today, like meaning making, person, forging identity, right? Who are you as a person? Who do you want to be as a person? I think there are a lot of ways to navigate that without stepping on too many landmines.
Yeah, maybe like less rigidity with a particular perspective, right? It's all about just opening up that dialogue and empowering the exploration. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
There's a question here. If you were to go back in time, we all wish we could do that, to your days as a hospice chaplain, what would you do differently in your work with children then? Now you know what you know now.
Yeah, it's interesting because this question, thanks, Kelly, ties a lot to your question, Jesse, which is, I thought in my role that what I was supposed to do as a chaplain is to have answers, right? And people had that expectation of me as a chaplain, right? That I somehow showed up with these core convictions, these core truths, and I was there to deliver this truth. And truthfully, I don't operate that way. And as a chaplain, I didn't operate that way either, but I thought that that's what I was supposed to do. So I ended up, rather than stepping out of myself, I ended up getting in my own way because I believed that I was supposed to um, have an answer rather than create the safe space. And I think in so many different types of roles and helping roles, whether you're a guidance counselor or you're a clergy person or you're a parent or you're somebody who cares about children and you're a child's advocate, I think so often we think we define who we're supposed to be by the role rather than by who we want to be in our presence as
Mm.
companions, as facilitators,
Yeah.
as stewards of supporting a child's growth and development ultimately. And so I think my affect would be very different walking into one of those hospice rooms today than than it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Joe. We are at time. So if you do have a question that we didn't get a chance to get to, just send us that question. You could put it into this feedback form. You could shoot us an email in response to the email that you'll get tomorrow. If you would, please give us your feedback in this survey. And I'm going to drop the link here in the chat if I can get it to come up. There we go. So I'm going to drop this link into the chat. You could also hold your phone over the QR code with the camera, and that would do it for you too. But we really appreciate your feedback. If you fill it out, the end page will also take you to a certificate. So that is one way that you can get that certificate. And as I mentioned, we will be sending it out to you tomorrow as well. So thanks for doing that. And a couple of other things I want to plug here at the end. One, we have a great resource page on our website. We have one that's devoted to COVID-19 and navigating through these complex times with podcast recordings and webinars and tip sheets and activities for parents and other people at home. So please check out the website. We have some books on there, things like that. If you want to take a deeper dive into this conversation, we mentioned at the beginning that Joe wrote a book around this topic, about supporting children through grief and loss. You can find information on that on our website, on the resource page. That was kind of my introduction to this world. It is a really great book, highly recommend it. So go check out the website. And then the last thing I want to plug, the last thing I want to plug is we do have 2 more webinars coming up in this kind of monthly webinar series between now and summer break. We are going to take a little break over the summer. We have a couple of great topics coming up. One with Donna Gaffney, who's a real expert in our field around childhood bereavement. She's going to be talking about what do children really know about death and grief. She's done some really interesting work on this. Excellent presenter. I encourage you to check that one out. And then I'm going to be leading a discussion around this topic of the grief remains, leading with a grief-informed lens in a post-pandemic world. We're getting the discussion started, anticipating that when we return to quote unquote normal, we're all going to want to move on and forget about the challenges of the pandemic. And our encouragement is going to be to help people to remember that grief is a lifelong process and that we're going to need to support kids, families, coworkers over the long term as a result of this collective experience that we've gone through. And I'll have some panelists join me for that discussion and talk about how they are conceiving of leadership during those times. Check out our website, the events page, and you can register for those. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today, for taking time out of, I know, what are very busy schedules. We're juggling a lot these days. So the fact that you spent this time with us, we really, really appreciate it. Joe, thank you so much for presenting. Really appreciate your perspective today. And I hope that this was a beneficial workshop for everybody. And I'm wishing you all the very best, and stay healthy and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.